Okay, so get this right. Some random person right. They turned like $1,000 into almost $1 million during the last election. And get this, they didn't do it by campaigning or anything. They did it by betting.
Wow.
Yeah. So today we're diving deep into this whole election betting thing. We're going to be looking at these platforms, Kalshi and Polymarket.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting how technology is changing how we engage with politics, you know? We're moving past the old ways of doing things like polls and pundits and stuff. And now we're in this crazy world where people are literally putting their money where their mouth is.
Exactly. And we're not talking about chump change here either. We're talking billions of dollars being wagered on these platforms. It's kind of like the stock market, correct? But instead of betting on companies, you're betting on the feat of democracy itself.
Yeah.
It's wild. It really makes you think what is driving this? Is it just the thrill of the gamble? Or is there something deeper going on here?
Right. Well, I mean, obviously the money is a big factor, right? But what I find really interesting is how these platforms can give us a real-time look at what the public is thinking and feeling. Polls, they just give you a snapshot in time. But these platforms are constantly changing. They're like a living, breathing reflection of public opinion.
Yeah, it's like having your finger on the pulse of the electorate.
Yeah.
But instead of feelings, it's like cold, hard cash driving the conversation.
So let's break this down a bit. What exactly are these platforms, Kalshi and Polymarket, and how do they actually work?
Okay, so basically they're platforms where you can bet on the outcomes of different events.
Yeah.
And that includes elections. So imagine you think candidate A is going to win the electoral college, right? On Kalshi, you could buy a contract that represents that outcome. So if candidate A wins, your contract goes up in value and you make money. But if they lose, well, you lose your investment. Okay, so it's like you're buying a little piece of the election's future.
Mm-hmm.
And you're hoping you pick the right horse, so to speak. But how much money are we talking about here? What kind of money is actually changing hands?
The numbers are crazy. So Polymarket, which is open to people all over the world, they've seen over $4 billion wagered on election stuff. And Kalshi, which is only for U.S. citizens and regulated by the CFTC, they've seen over $500 million.
Wow. So that's almost $5 billion total.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing.
That's insane. And looking at the current odds, as of our latest data, Trump is actually favored to win the Electoral College. But Kamala Harris is ahead in the popular vote. We'll get into the specifics of those numbers later. But first, I'm curious, what are the big differences between these two platforms?
Yeah, so the main difference is their approach to regulations and who they're targeting. So Kalshi, since it's regulated by the CFTC, they operate within a very clear legal framework. They really prioritize security and compliance for their users, all the US-based users. Polymarket, on the other hand, they kind of exist in what we call a regulatory gray area.
Okay, regulatory gray area. What does that even mean?
So basically, it means they're not under the same level of oversight from U.S. regulators because they're open to people all over the world. This means they have a much more diverse group of bettors. But it also raises some questions about potential risks and how they're held accountable.
So Kalshi is playing by the rules, going for that sense of security, while Polymarket is the Wild West of election betting. Interesting. But here's the big question. Why should we care? Is this just a bunch of rich people gambling with the fate of the country?
It's definitely more than that. These platforms are like a window into what the public is actually thinking and feeling. And you could argue that they're even more accurate and up-to-date than traditional polls. Instead of relying on these static surveys that only capture a moment in time, we can actually see how opinions are changing in real time.
Yeah, it's like a constant feedback loop, a live representation of the electorate's mood. But let's get practical here. How could this actually influence an election?
So let's say a candidate gives a really powerful speech, right? And then all of a sudden the odds on Kalshi or Polymarket shift in their favor. That shift is visible to everyone, and it can actually start to influence how people see the candidate. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more people see a candidate as the favorite, the more likely they are to believe that candidate will actually win.
Wow. So these platforms that were designed to predict the future, they could actually end up shaping it.
Right.
It makes you wonder, are we just watching democracy unfold?
Yeah.
Or are we becoming active participants through these bets?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? The line between observing and influencing is getting blurry. And the implications are exciting, but also a little bit scary if you think about it.
Totally. But before we get too deep into those implications, let's take a closer look at how these platforms actually function. I know they have very different approaches to security and transparency.
Right. So Kalshi, because they're regulated, they rely on traditional financial security measures and compliance protocols to protect their users and their money. It's like a bank with all the safety measures you'd expect.
So with Kalshi, you can be pretty confident that your money's safe and that the platform itself is secure. But what about Polymarket? How do they ensure fairness and security when they're operating in this regulatory gray area?
They lean heavily on the blockchain. So every bet, every transaction is recorded on a public ledger. And that ledger can't be tampered with. It's like a permanent record of every move. That ensures accountability and makes it really hard to manipulate the system.
So Kalshi is all about regulation and traditional security. And Polymarket is embracing the cutting-edge world of blockchain. Two very different approaches to basically the same goal. Predicting the future of our elections, it makes you wonder which approach is better, which one is more ethical.
Yeah, those are some big questions, and those are the kind of questions we're going to be exploring further as we dive deeper into this whole world. But for now, let's shift gears a bit and take a closer look at those odds we talked about earlier. Trump favored for the Electoral College, but Harris leading the popular vote. What do those numbers actually tell us about how the public sees this election?
Right, because these aren't just random numbers. They're based on real people placing real bets. So what are these platforms telling us about the collective wisdom? Or maybe the collective anxiety of the betting public?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll unpack in the next part of our deep dive. We'll break down those odds, explore what's influencing them, and see what they might reveal about what's really going on in this election.
I'm excited to dive in.
Me too.
All right, so we've talked about how these election betting platforms are like a whole new way to look at politics. We've got these two big players, Kalshi and Polymarket, and they each have their own way of dealing with security and regulations. But let's get to the heart of the matter. The odds. Last time we checked, Trump was favored to win the Electoral College, but Harris was ahead in the popular vote. What's the deal with those numbers?
Well, you have to remember, these odds, they aren't set in stone. They're always changing based on a bunch of different things, like news stories, campaign announcements, what's trending on social media, even stuff happening around the world. It's like a reflection of how the people betting are understanding and reacting to all the changes in the political world.
So it's not just about who people want to win, but who they think is most likely to win, based on all the information they have at any given time. It's like everyone's trying to predict the future together.
Exactly. And the fact that Trump is favored in the Electoral College, but Harris is leading the popular vote, it really shows how these platforms capture the complexities of our election system. People aren't just betting on who gets the most votes overall. They're also thinking about the Electoral College and how it can lead to different winners.
That's a really good point. It's like people are becoming mini experts on how elections work just to place a bet. It's almost like they're learning about civics through gambling.
Yeah, there's something to that. By using these platforms, people are learning about how our elections work and what influences the results. It's kind of like a form of civic education, but with a financial incentive.
Wait, let's not forget about the money. People aren't just betting for fun. They're hoping to win big. So how are these platforms changing how campaigns work? Are campaigns actually paying attention to these odds?
Oh, absolutely. In the past, campaigns relied on things like polls and focus groups to figure out what the public was thinking. But these platforms are different. They provide information in real time, and that's incredibly valuable.
So instead of waiting weeks for a poll to come out, campaigns can see how people are reacting to their message right away.
Exactly. Let's say a campaign announces a new policy, and then the odds on Kalshi or Polymarket suddenly move against their candidate. That's a sign that the policy isn't popular, and the campaign might want to rethink their strategy.
It's like an early warning system for campaigns. But it's not just about reacting to negative feedback. Campaigns can also use these platforms to build on positive momentum.
Absolutely. Imagine a candidate does really well in a debate, and the odds on these platforms jump in their favor. The campaign can then use that to their advantage, show everyone how popular their candidate is, and maybe even attract more donations and volunteers.
It's like these platforms are adding a whole new level of strategy to campaigns. It's both fascinating and a little bit scary.
I agree. There's definitely an element of unpredictability and risk that comes with these platforms. They can make successes bigger and failures more painful. The stakes are higher for everyone involved.
But it's not just campaigns that are paying attention, right?
Mhm.
You mentioned earlier that these platforms could actually shape how the public sees the election. How does that work?
Well, imagine you're someone who doesn't really follow politics closely. You see headlines about Trump being favored on these betting platforms, and it starts to stick in your mind. You might not even realize it. But it could change how you think about who's likely to win.
It's like the odds themselves become a kind of news story,
Yeah.
shaping the narrative around the election.
Yeah,
And the more popular these platforms become, the more powerful that narrative could be.
exactly. And this brings up the question of whether these platforms could actually create a self-fulfilling prophecy. If enough people see a candidate as the favorite, could that actually influence the outcome of the election?
It's like a chicken and egg situation.
Yeah,
Do these platforms reflect what people are thinking, or do they actually shape what people think?
it's a complicated question with no easy answers.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's a question that goes to the core of what democracy means. Are we comfortable with a system where money and algorithms have so much influence on our politics?
It's definitely something to think about.
Hmm.
But let's bring it back to our listeners for a moment. Let's say election betting becomes super common, like as normal as checking the latest polls. How could that affect the average voter?
Well, on the one hand, it could lead to people being more informed and engaged. If people have money on the line, they might be more likely to stay up to date on what's happening and really research the candidate.
It's like making civic duty a game. Instead of just complaining about politics, people might actually feel like they need to understand the issues.
Exactly. But there's also a potential downside.
Oh boy, here it comes.
Yeah, because when you make political predictions about money, it could make existing inequalities even worse. People with more money and access to information might have a big advantage when it comes to predicting the outcome.
It's like a pay-to-win system for political influence. The people who can afford to bet big and use fancy algorithms and insider knowledge, they could end up having way more influence on the result.
That's definitely a concern. And it's something we need to keep in mind as these platforms continue to develop. We don't want a system where money controls everything.
Right. We want ideas to matter.
Exactly.
It's a tough balance, isn't it? We want to encourage new technology and use it to make our political system better. But we also have to be careful to make sure these tools are being used the right way, in a way that strengthens our democracy, not weakens it.
It's like we're always trying to find the right balance between new ideas and security, between freedom and responsibility.
And these election betting platforms are right in the middle of that struggle.
They're like a tiny version of the bigger changes happening in technology and society. And the choices we make now about how we use these platforms will have a big impact on the future of our democracy.
It's a lot to think about. But that's what makes this whole topic so interesting. We're not just talking about betting on elections. We're talking about the future of technology, the future of politics, and the future of democracy itself.
And as we move to the last part of our deep dive, we'll explore those implications even further. We'll challenge ourselves and our listeners to really think critically about the role these platforms will play in shaping our world.
Okay, so we've really dug into these election betting platforms, right? We've talked about how they work, how they could affect campaigns, and even how they could shape public opinion. But the question I keep coming back to is like, what does it all mean? What does this mean for the future of democracy?
It's a big question, and there's no easy answer, but it's definitely something we need to be thinking about. Because as these platforms become more popular and influential, they're forcing us to confront some really fundamental questions about how we engage with politics, the role of technology in our democracy, and even what democracy means in the digital age.
It's like we're pioneers in this new digital world where the rules are still being written. We have this amazing technology that can connect us, inform us, and empower us. But it also has the power to divide us, manipulate us, and even distort our democracy.
Yeah, that's the thing about technology, isn't it? It's a double-edged sword. We're always pushing for new innovations, new ways to solve problems and make our lives better. But every new tool comes with its own set of risks and challenges.
It's like we're playing this high-stakes game with the future of our democracy, and every decision we make could change the outcome. And these election betting platforms, they're not just bystanders, they're becoming major players.
That's why these conversations are so important. We need to be thinking about the potential consequences, both good and bad, of bringing these platforms into our political system. The decisions we make today will have a lasting impact.
Absolutely. So let's think about this from our listeners' perspective. Imagine election betting becomes as normal as checking the polls. How could that affect the average voter?
Well, it could definitely make people more informed and engaged. If you have money on the line, you're going to pay more attention to what's happening. You're going to want to research the candidates and the issues.
It's like the saying, put your money where your mouth is.
Yeah.
People wouldn't just be passively watching politics anymore. They'd be actively participating.
Exactly. And that kind of engagement could be really good for our democracy. More informed voters lead to better decisions.
Makes sense.
But there's also a potential downside.
Yeah, oh, I have a feeling I know what's coming.
Yeah. This whole idea of betting on politics,
I know.
it could actually make existing inequalities even worse.
Oh, so.
Well, people with more money and better access to information, they would have a big advantage in these betting markets.
So it could become like a pay-to-play system for political influence.
Yeah,
The people with the most money would have the most say.
exactly. And that's something we really need to be careful about. We don't want a system where money controls everything.
Right. We want a system where everyone's voice matters. It's a tough balance. We want to encourage innovation and use technology to improve things. But we also have to make sure that technology is being used responsibly and ethically.
We have to make sure it strengthens our democracy, not weakens it.
It's like we're constantly navigating this tension between wanting new and exciting things and making sure those things don't backfire.
Right. And these election betting platforms are a perfect example of that.
They represent both the incredible potential of technology and the very real risks that come with it.
It all comes back to this fundamental question. What does democracy mean in the digital age? Are we just observers? Or are we active participants shaping the outcome?
It's a question we all need to be asking ourselves, because these platforms are becoming more and more intertwined with our politics.
And the choices we make now will have a lasting impact.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the nuts and bolts of how these platforms work to the broader implications for our democracy. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking conversation.
It really has.
And I hope our listeners are walking away with a lot to think about. As these platforms continue to evolve, it's crucial that we stay informed, engage in these discussions, and make sure our voices are heard. The future of our democracy may depend on it.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.